Good morning from the Unity Church Children's Garden. I'm Anna, and today I am surrounded by squash, and it is a picture of abundance. Long ago, the native people on this continent planted three sisters, squash, beans, and corn, and those three plants have fed so many people, and for that we're very grateful. So today I am going to light our candle in honor of the squash and the abundance of squash and knowledge of people around us who are hungry, and thinking about how this garden can feed our neighbors. We light this chalice as a symbol of our faith, the light of truth and the warmth of love. And if you'll sing with me now, Rise Up, O Flame. Rise up, O flame, by thy light glowing, show to us beauty, vision, and joy. Rise up, O flame, by thy light glowing, show to us beauty, vision, and joy. And then we always move to our joys and sorrows. This morning, as I left the house, my front yard is full of monarda, which is also called bee balm. And it's at the end of its bloom, and it's been full of bumblebees. It's my own personal pollinator garden. So I'm kind of sad that they're done blooming, but that's my bluestone. After the flower comes the seed and the fruit. And now the goldfinches are in that monarda patch, and they're feeding furiously on the seeds that have formed from the pollinated flowers, and that makes me happy. So I'll give you a second to think about what's going on in your life, the people close to you, and you can do the same ritual, or you can just keep it in the quiet of your heart. Okay. Dan has a story this morning about a little girl named Zora and her garden that I think is applicable for this morning. Dan?
Zora's Zucchinis by Catherine Pryor, illustrated by Anna Raff. And the publisher of this book is called Readers to Eaters. It was only the third day of summer vacation, but Zora was already out of ideas. Zora rode her bike in large, lazy circles around the neighborhood, and just like the day before and the day before that. When Zora rode by the hardware store, well, she noticed something new. A bunch of plants with fuzzy green leaves. Free zucchini, read Zora. A Z like me. And she filled her basket with zucchini plants and headed home. Oh, look what I found, Zora announced. Zucchini. I'm going to plant these in our garden. And Zora dug big holes so the roots had room to grow, and she settled the plants snugly in the soil, and she watered each one. Oh, that's going to be a lot of zucchini, said her father. We'll eat it, Zora promised. As June warmed into July hot, Zora tended her garden. She watered the plants when the leaves got droopy. She cheered every time she saw a new yellow-orange zucchini blossom. One morning, Zora spotted her very first zucchini. She snapped it off the vine with a quick twist and raced to show her family. Zora's family found a new way to cook zucchini every day. Her brother made bread. Her sister made soup. Her parents marinated and grated and barbecued. And as Zora's garden grew, they ate zucchini for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. More? Zora offered. By the first day of August, Zora's garden was a jungle of prickly, tickly, bushy, blossomy plants. Every single one of those plants was covered with zucchini. There was no way her family could eat it all. Well, Zora peered into her neighbor's garden. It was full of tomatoes, but no zucchini. "Hi, Ms. Thompson, would you like to trade some tomatoes for some zucchini?" Zora asked. "Oh, absolutely," Ms. Thompson replied. Zora swapped an armful of zucchini for an armful of tomatoes. Zora's zucchini kept growing. "This is crazy," she said. She loaded up her bike and gave every last one away. The next day, Zora found even more zucchini. "Seriously?" she said. Zora thought and thought. She had an idea, but she knew she couldn't do it alone. Her brother painted the signs. Her parents printed the flyers. Zora and her sister posted them all over the neighborhood. And the signs say, "Garden Swap." On Saturday, Zora's Garden Swap was open for business. Take a veggie, leave a veggie. Or at least take some zucchini, please. Zora straightened her sign. She checked the time. The sun got hotter. Zora's feet got fidgetier. She began to worry that her garden swap was a garden flop. Then Zora saw Ms. Rivera carrying a big bowl of raspberries and Mr. Peterson bringing potatoes, and neighbors stopped by with carrots, peppers, and green beans from their gardens. They shared plums, apricots, cherries from their trees. People left whatever they had too much of and took whatever they wanted. Zora traded and traded until all her zucchini was gone. Zora looked around at the busy, noisy jumble of munching, laughing, chatting neighbors. Her zucchini garden had brought so many people together. She was already plotting what to grow next summer. And that's the end of this story.
Thanks, Dan. That was great. I had been away from this garden for a little bit. My husband and I were on a little cross-country road trip. And when I came back, the squash plants had been this big when I left. And I came back and I found this. If you look at this garden, if you come this week, the squash is enormous. And they are doing very, very well. And so we thought we'd do our lesson on this today, and just like Zora, we've got some extra that we can share. We have yellow squash and we have zucchini. These are examples of summer squash, and they are the ones that you pick now, you harvest now. We try to catch them before they get as big as this. If they get really huge, that means that the seeds inside have fully formed, and then they get kind of tough. If I find one like that, sometimes I have to peel it, but I'll shred it and I'll put it into zucchini bread or fritters or something like that. But what you really want is to to catch them young. In fact, the Narragansett word for squash translates as the squash that you eat young or raw. So they knew that. If you wanted to grow squash next year, you would let this grow to maturity and get all hard and dry, and then you could harvest the seeds. So that's a summer squash, and that's on this side of the garden. And on this side of the garden, we have butternut squash, and there's a few delicata in there too. These are winter squash. These you don't harvest until late summer or fall because you want the skin to get hard. And then when you do harvest them, you cure them in a warm place, and at that point you can keep them all winter, hence the name winter squash. So we've got both kinds of squash here, summer squash and winter squash. Summer squash, winter squash. If you come to the garden, or if you have a garden at your house, you can learn some things about squash, and they're really, really interesting plants. Right here in front of me, oh, one just went in. Here I have a flower of squash, and you can see they're big and yellow. In Mexico, they will take these, dip them in a batter, and fry the blossoms, and that's quite a delicacy. The one that I'm pointing to has nothing on the stem. I don't know if you can see that, Michelle, but this is a male flower, and it's got stamens inside with lots of pollen. And perhaps you saw that little bee that just went in there and then flew out again when I shook the blossom. That was a bee. That was a squash bee, and I'll talk a little more about those in a minute. The other flowers on the same plant will be female flowers, and we'll have to paw through here and try to find one. But I know up here, oh, right in front of me right here, this was a blossom. It is now a young butternut squash that is starting to grow. Not very big. This is what's left of the flower. The female flowers have got the ovary at the base of them that will become the squash, and that's how you can tell them apart. These we don't usually harvest for squash fritters, but these, the male flowers, we do. The male flowers will fall off, and here's one that's done. It will be like this. It will fall off and be done and spent. And it kind of raises the question, if all of these plants, both the zucchini, the yellow squash, the delicata, the butternut, cucumbers do this too, they have male and female flowers. And what on earth for? Because the classic flower has the male parts and the female parts together in one house, as it were. If you think about it, the whole point of the flower is to spread pollen around. And they're big and showy and have some perfume and have some nectar and the pollen, and that's what the bees are going for. That's what they want. In the process of visiting different flowers, they are passing the pollen from one to another. And the strongest seeds and the strongest plants grow from seeds that have had pollen from different plants mixed together. That's called cross-pollination. And by having male and female blossoms, the squash kind of assures that, because the bees will come and load up on pollen, and then they visit the female flowers, and that pollen gets all mixed up. So it's really kind of clever, and it's typical for this plant family. The other thing that is super cool about these plants, because the squashes originated in Central and South America and then were traded and spread all through North America, there is a whole group of insects that is specialized for living on squash. There's a squash bug that actually is not a good thing to have because they can damage the stems. And then there's the squash bee. There's two genera for that, two distinct groups of species, but they specialize on pollinating these plants. And two of them just flew in here. They look sort of like a bumblebee crossed with a honeybee. They're broader and bigger, and they're fuzzy like a bumble, but they are a little smoother than a bumble, and they've got really fine striping on their abdomen. I've got some links on the webpage where you can find out more about them. But squash bees are specialized for getting the pollen out of these plants and moving them around, and they are the most effective pollinators of squash crops. So farmers that grow pumpkins, that grow squashes, that grow cucumbers, they really, really want those bees, those native bees that kind of grew up and evolved with the squash. So I'm gonna come around here and we're gonna harvest a few. We don't harvest the winter squash, so we have to be really, really careful here. But here's some zucchini. And if I lift them up, one of the things you're going to notice is the prickles on the leaves. And the native people, when they planted Three Sisters gardens, would put the squash around their corn, and that helps keep some of the critters out because those prickles are not fun to step on. So you'll have to be careful when you lift the leaves. But down underneath here, we can find, oops, it says yellow squash. We've got yellow squash growing here, and some of them still have the blossoms on the end. But when you come, you can help us harvest those. And back there, the zucchini, the same thing. We've got really big zucchini back here. Let's see if I can get my cord untangled. These leaves are good at hanging on to stuff. So the zucchini is darker green. And again, you lift up the leaves and you look underneath. If you see blossoms, take a look, see if you can find male and female blossoms, see if you can find the bees. And somewhere under here, there will be some zucchini. So that's pretty exciting. Now I'm going to share a recipe for you. I'm going to share a recipe with you for one of my favorite ways to eat squash. You could use zucchini, you could use patty pan, you could use summer squash, the yellow squash. Any one of those will work. I'm going to use the yellow squash. So once you've picked your squash, the question is what to do with it. And I think a lot of people, I meet a lot of people who say, I don't like squash. And I think part of it is the name, because it sounds like it's squished like squash. And the name squash actually comes from a Native American Narragansett word for squash, a scutula squash or something like that. So I think the name's a little bit, it's got an interesting history, but it's a little bit unfortunate. And the other unfortunate thing is that I grew up with squash being cooked to a pulp, and it wasn't very interesting. So it really was kind of squashed. But I'm going to show you one of my favorite recipes for this wonderful vegetable. And what you want to do is keep it a little bit on the crisp, tender side so that it's not completely squished. For this recipe, we're going to cut the squash into rounds and bread it and then bake it in the oven. So the first thing you want to do is preheat your oven to 450, 500 degrees. Get a flat cookie sheet, a baking pan, line it with something. I'm using a silpat mat, but parchment or aluminum foil will work. If you don't have that, just put the squash directly on there, but cleanup is easier if you have it protected somewhere. You'll need a couple bowls. You'll need salt, pepper, cayenne pepper if you like a little bit of heat. You'll need some shredded Parmesan. And the recipe calls for panko, which are basically a rice cracker crumb that's used in Japanese cooking. Anything that is light and crispy will work. If you've got cornflakes or Rice Krispies, you can put them in a bag. And what I did was I just kind of squished them with my finger until I had crumbs. So some kind of a crumb mixture. And you need your squash. So when I do this, if you're doing this with your family, the parents should watch very carefully. I'm going to use a big knife and you might want to use a smaller one. I'm going to cut off the stem end and I'm going to cut off the flower end. Reminds me that we wouldn't have any kind of fruit if we didn't have flowers and the bees to pollinate it. But I'm going to move these down here and start by cutting my squash. And I will cut the flower end off, the stem end off, and you want the pieces to be about 1/2 inch thick. 1/2 inch is probably about the size of your little finger wide, and you're just going to cut that. And by the way, you've washed your hands first before you do this, which I did before I came outside. So here are my squash rounds. And when we cut them open, in the center, we can see the pattern of the seeds. This being a summer squash, you want to harvest before the seeds are mature, when they're still young and tender, but you can see where they are. So again, the connection to the flowers and the bees are really, really important. I'm going to take a little bit of oil, put my squash in my bowl, cover it with a little oil. And the recipe is for a large amount of squash, and so it's actually measured out. I'm going to take a few shortcuts today. I want to toss that with the oil, sprinkle it with my sea salt, and sprinkle it with a bit of pepper. And since I do like a little heat, I will use the cayenne, and I will sprinkle that on here. And you can use as much or as little of all of that as you want. If you're watching salt, use less. If you don't like heat, don't do that. You can also use oregano if you have that handy and you want that flavor in here. I'm stirring it, and you can see how my squash that's in this bowl is kind of speckled because it's got all those seasonings on it. And then in my other bowl, I'm going to take equal parts Parmesan. That's about half a cup. And my panko crumbs, or in this case, crushed Rice Krispies. I'll put that in here like this. And the kids, if they're helping you, that's actually about right. If the kids are helping you in the kitchen, which I hope they are, they will love crushing the cereal, and they will love this next step. And I have found that when I have kids in the kitchen and they get to help me prepare food, and they touch it and they smell it, then when it comes time to eat that, they're much more likely to indulge. So I am stirring my crumbs and my Parmesan together so it's thoroughly mixed. And here's the fun part. I'm going to put this in a safe place where it's not going to hurt anything. I take my squash, and one at a time I'm going to coat it in the bread crumb mixture and put it on the cookie sheet. So here's number one. Don't you love that cardinal singing? It's a great part about cooking outside. Put that there, and for each one I coat it in my mixture, and when I'm all done, I'll have a whole sheet of breaded squash. Hopefully the oven is hot. It's at 450 degrees. You slide it in. You leave it there for about 20 minutes. You'll want to check it. If it looks like it's getting too brown, you can take it out earlier. If you test it with a fork and the squash is tender inside, then it's ready. It basically steams inside the breading. And then you take it out and let it cool. And kids love to dip things, so I highly recommend your favorite marinara sauce, and put a little of that on a plate and take the breaded baked squash grounds and dip it in there, and you have a wonderful treat that will go with any summer meal. So enjoy that recipe. So we've looked at squash today. We've looked at squash bees. And it is time to say goodbye. I hope that you will visit the garden this week. Help us water. It's been very dry. Help us harvest for your own use, for the food shelf. And keep an eye out for those squash bees. If you follow them, you might even find where their nests are. They're solitary, and they make tunnels in the ground and then lay their eggs down under there. And they feed the babies on the pollen that they gather. So, oops, one around my nose. So that's kind of a lesson too. If you're out in the garden and a bee is buzzing around your head, just be very, very still. Noticed I didn't swat at it. I was just very quiet, and they kind of look and decide, okay, she's not a threat, and we're all good. Anyway, let us think about squash and the abundance of these plants, and the abundance that we have available to share with our neighbors, with people who are hungry and maybe can't get to the store well because of COVID. And with that in mind, and with thanks to the native people who taught us about this plant and how to grow it, and to grow it as three sisters, we will extinguish our chalice. And as we do so, we know that the light of truth and the warmth of love go with us in our heart. Have a wonderful week.